Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, a case study of reducing exposure to serious incidents. My name is Cassie Bolter and I'm the Events and Partnership Manager at Sentis. Today's presenters, we have Dr. Amy Hawkes from Sentis. As a Head of Psychology, Amy brings best practice insights to business, strong statistical skills and applied research methodology to her work. Amy leads the research team and provides strategic guidance to the assessment tools and reporting offered by Sentis. Joining Amy, we have Warren Smith, founder of Incident Analytics. His specialist areas include serious injury and fatality exposure management, leadership development and behaviour change, safety governance and systems alignment, and the human factors associated with error and reliability. Just before we get underway, please note that we're unable to hear you during the presentation. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the question box and we'll address them at the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cassie. Before we get started, I'd love to briefly acknowledge the country in which we're meeting on today. So we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia and recognise their connections to land, waters and community. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, which is all around Australia, and welcome to all of our listeners and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us on the call today. And we do this because we value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture and knowledge. For those of us who are joining us today who are perhaps not familiar with Sentis, I'd like to take a moment to introduce us. Our key mission is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. And we do this by sharing our knowledge around safety and the psychology of safety through training and coaching, inviting different conversations during our programs and combining what we know about the brain and psychology, leadership and team dynamics into the world of what you do at work. So we're very pleased to be partnering with Incident Analytics and to have Warren here with us today to provide some insights for organisations from incident reporting data. A quick overview of our plan for our webinar this morning is to introduce our meta-incident analysis from Incident Analytics and our case organisation, to run through incident categorisation for this organisation, look at some of the contributing factor trends related to their incidents, and then spend some time looking at some of the recommendations that came out of this data, along with where the organisation is up to now. So we're delighted to have the opportunity to share the really interesting set of meta-incident analysis results with you all, and to give you a brief introduction to what is a meta-incident analysis. It involves, I'm sure most of the listeners who are joining us today, Warren, are familiar with incident reporting in their organisation, and probably quite familiar with a variety of different systems for collecting the data when an incident might occur. But often there isn't the opportunity to do much with that data overall across many years. And that's the benefit of this meta-incident analysis process. Looks across many months or many years of incident reports. And I'd love it, Warren, if you could briefly, I know it's quite a detailed process, but very briefly give us a sense of the steps that you go through to look at this data. Sure,
thanks, Amy. And can you hear me still? Great, glad my microphone's still working. And I'll just say up front, look, the wonderful thing about incidents, I mean, they're bad, obviously, in so many ways. Unplanned outcomes that involve particularly, kind of hurt or things that break. Usually they're not viewed very favourably by organisations, but the learning opportunity from them is just extraordinary. And it never ceases to amaze me what you can extract in terms of how an organisation actually operates in the field, but also how their systems tend to support each other in the background as well. Incidents, when you analyse them in the right way, can tell you enormous amounts about how the culture is actually functioning. Beyond just simply that one single event where something has gone unplanned. But these 5 steps here, they're I think the 5 steps, we've tried to make this process as neat and as tidy and as sort of conceptually obvious as we can. And the first step that we take is obviously have a look at, which incidents should we be bothering to do a really serious deep dive on? Which investigation resources are usually fairly scarce in most organisations, so you can't investigate everything. You need to pick and choose the events where you think you have the greatest learning potential, but also probably the most kind of potentially severe impact on the organisation and its people. So we take the path of looking at severity potential. Very, very few actual really, really severe incidents actually occur. A lot more happen that have actually got some potential for something quite nasty to happen. So we take a very specific and very decision tree based approach to looking at severity so that we can actually feed the right incidents into the deep dive analysis. Second thing is we're looking at controls that really should have or could have helped that situation from even becoming a problem in the first place. For instance, things like working at height, you'd expect to see certain things in place like harnesses and anchor points, being used appropriately. When it comes to, traffic internally within an organisation, you'd expect exclusion zones to be being observed and to be the right kind of distance, for instance, to keep pedestrians and moving mobile equipment, separated. So it's those controls that we're looking at that, if they were in place, properly implemented, would have made a huge difference, to the risk or the exposure situation. We're then looking at, well, why weren't they? In an antecedent sense, what were the causal factors behind those controls not really being implemented the way they should be? Both human factor, they're the really easy ones to see because, usually there's a person involved. It's very easy to sort of establish, what went wrong at the person level. Unfortunately, that's where mostly things stop. We do a really good job of blaming the worker. There generally are a whole range of other factors though influencing that situation that we really should be looking at a local operational level. And sometimes even at an organisational level, we're looking at systems that are supposed to support people on the front line. We've also got then a lot of data that comes out of that. So our job then is to try and bring that back to what are the 4, 5 or 6 things that are really important here to know, that the thematic analysis is telling us. So that learning phase is really about trying to extract prioritised outcomes from that learning. And the last point, of course, is, and this is where the rubber hits the road, if you've got a clear picture of what's gone wrong and why it's gone wrong, unless you actually have very strong effective actions to address those issues, all of the analysis in the world is really not worth very much. And we know through looking at something like 10,000 incidents and about 1,500 really meaningful incident investigation reports in the last 18 months to 2 years. I'm just completing a study on that number of incidents now and looking for the aggregated themes. The actions in those incident reports are generally fairly weak. And I'll say generally, sometimes there's some really excellent outcomes, but mostly they're not. Mostly it's there's a fair bit of box ticking when it comes to that part of the investigation process. So we had a lot of learning out of this process, Amy.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Warren. And I think there's a really good summary of quite a detailed process and the value that really comes out of not just looking at each individual incident that's occurred in this level of detail, but as you mentioned, looking across many incidents and looking at what are the common themes or threads that start to come out repeatedly is where you really start to get additional value through this process. That's fantastic. I'll jump now to introduce our case study organization. So this organization is based in the utilities sector with a workforce of around 800 people, working across a large metropolitan and regional area. And they really sought out to do the meta-incident analysis because they'd had a strong emphasis on safety for quite a few years. They'd developed a new safety vision and had been really working on their safety strategy and their safety culture. And they'd been seeing some improvements in their safety culture and their safety climate results with us, and had not quite seen that transfer across into incident rates the way they thought they would have. They'd seen a small decline in those lagging indicators, but not as much as they were expecting. So they were really curious to unpack their incident data, gain some more insights. And that was what sort of prompted that first discussion around doing this meta-incident analysis process, to start to look at some of those causal factors you were talking about, Warren, some of those controls, and starting to think about it from that perspective as well. So that gave us...
I've got to say, Amy,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's what's really fascinating is that most organisations struggle with this issue, in that they're measuring things like lost time injury, medical treatment, first aids. The lag metrics tend to dominate what they're looking at, and how they're monitoring their own success or lack of success. And the difficulty with that is that, of course, that your reporting culture could be shifting and changing as you go anyway. So looking at those hard numbers, in that lag metric sense, it's not the most reliable way to assess whether or not you're getting better, staying static, or actually getting worse, within your safety environment. And this case study really showed that up quite clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we were able to show, was that improvement in safety culture and a reduction in their underreporting rate over that time, which we were able to say, well, look, it actually means that you're getting more information in now. Your results and your numbers don't look like they've declined, but it's because you're probably missing a lot of things last time. And so, that was, you're right, that was where the opportunity here was, to start to unpack that serious injury or the fatality potential side of things, that high potential, high risk side of those incidents that were occurring as well. So we had a great question submitted before the webinar started in the registration portal, asking us about how the incident data was collated and whether or not it was paper reports. So this organization was using a computer-based reporting system, piece of software, wasn't it, Warren? So you were able to get all the information out of that. So it wasn't the case of a paper reporting system for this organization, but there was a really good question.
No, it has happened. I don't want it to anybody who's listening on this webinar, don't feel like you've got to have a fully digitized process in order to be able to perform this kind of batched incident analysis. Once I was involved with an organisation that had 14 different sites with about 17 different languages involved, and the incident reports were in each of those different languages, in PDF format, in all sorts of weird and wonderful formats. It's all still doable. It's actually almost more necessary when you have that diversity of incident report outputs. And in this case, we had quite a large number of incidents. Amy, do you mind if I just talk through this?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We had quite a large number of incidents to look at, 685 over about just over a 2-year period, which is about as far back as we typically recommend any organisation goes, because a lot changes in terms of your operational culture. Even the structure of your operations can change quite dramatically over 3 to 4 to 5 year periods. So we say 2 years is about as far as we'd like to go back, where the information is still going to be quite valid. And we reviewed those and it wasn't just incidents, it was near misses. We reviewed them for their severity potential. We have quite a kind of a strict set of parameters, a decision tree process that allows us to be very consistent, and accurate in that space. Obviously, we're looking for things like that fall under those classical categories of fall from height, mobile equipment, interactions, suspended load, electrical contact, like arc flash and so forth. The typical things that we'd be more worried about, that if it did go wrong, we would find ourselves staring at a potentially very nasty situation. Now, 114 of those incidents turned out to be what we would classically call serious injury or fatality potential, or SIFp, as it's shortened, and we subjected those to our analytical process. Interestingly enough, we had 1,000 or more hazards and control breaches that sat in the database that we were able to look at. We're actually able to interrogate that organisation's system directly because it was the most efficient way to do it, rather than having transfers of information back and forth. And fascinatingly, the 1,000 hazards, you could really see very clearly how they were pointing as weak signals almost across the board to those 114 incidents. So you could say in some ways there was this body of predictive information here that was going to tell us that those 114 incidents were likely to occur and still occur in the future, if that's what you're looking for. Interesting enough, this particular organisation's risk profile really dictated that more than 50% of the serious incidents were motor vehicle related. Any organisation that has a lot of vehicles on the road, we all know how uncontrolled that environment can be, and how challenging it can be to sort of establish strong controls in that space. And these guys certainly had their fair share of that kind of risk.
Yeah, and so that meant that you approached the analysis by separating out motor vehicles.
Yes, it was because motor vehicles, and most of the people on this webinar will know that there are a lot of different ways that a motor vehicle incident can occur. We like to treat, because it usually forms a fairly large percentage of SIFp potential incidents, we break it down to all of the different types of vehicle, kind of potential drama. One could be simple collisions, another could be rollovers, another could be road departure, another one might be involving trailer disconnection, another one might be load, unsecured load. So there's a lot of different ways, and there are different controls that go with those different motor vehicle risk categories. So we separated that out from their other more classical, kind of static risks that they had.
Fantastic. Would you like to give us a quick
sure.
high-level view of the overall data?
So the good news in this situation for us was that we actually had access to some tremendous data around work hours. We even had information on their compensation data, compensation costs, lost time injury. We're not going to show that here, but we certainly, knowing the work hours involved in this operation really helps us to sort of more accurately understand the migration of the statistics over that 2-year period. There was barely any kind of change to work hours per year, so that was great because that was relatively static. What it did then show, when we were starting to look at incidents being reported and near misses reported an increase over that time, largely due to a very strong drive on near miss reporting. And that's what you would hope would happen. We get more of them being reported, because people can choose not to report any near miss at all. Like nothing bad's happened. It's all in, I can store it up in my head and never ever speak about it again. Whereas I can't do that with a finger that's been badly damaged or cut or lacerated. I can't do that with a twisted ankle where I'm not going to be off work for a day or two. So that was fascinating to see that increase over that time. At the same time, we had the same reduction in recordable incidents on the basis of man hours, about a 7.5% reduction, which is not insubstantial. And a lot of those near misses were actually in those recordable incidents as well. The big one that we found that was fascinating over that 2-year period was something like a 1/3 reduction in SIFp potential incidents year on year, which is a very big shift. And this was as a result of a whole range of strategies that this organisation had deployed with Sentis's help around leadership, around supervision, around how teams function, around how pre-starts are actually managed. So it was tremendous to sort of ease their mind that, in fact, depending upon which lens they want to apply on their incidents and how they're measuring and monitoring that, you can get some fairly benign responses to that, or you can actually see, very accurate information about improvement or lack of. And in this case, it was significant improvement, on a range of fronts they weren't really aware of because they weren't actually monitoring it in their safety data in that way. It's a reasonably steady average of 40 hazards reported per month, and an uplift in that time as well. So, And I think the next slide starts to speak to a couple of the other sort of more nuanced elements of this. When it came to incident categorisation, Amy, this is a bit of a shock, I've got to say, it almost always is, that incidents that actually go to the trouble of categorising, organisations that go to the trouble of categorising their incidents, they usually use some form of risk matrix, based on likelihood and potential severity. In this case, something like 5, 6, or 7/8 of their SIFp potential incidents didn't hit their radar as anything serious. They were rating them as either moderate, minor, or negligible in their categorisation. The major and extreme categories, which we would say are the appropriate ones for serious injury or fatality potential events, didn't see very many incidents being plugged into that zone in the right way. On the flip side, what was really interesting, half of the incidents they did actually rate as major or extreme probably didn't need to. I mean, yeah, sure, they were probably lost time injuries. Nobody wants a lost time situation because it usually means somebody's been hurt enough to be off work for a couple of days at least. But when the incident is really fairly benign in terms of not life-changing potential at all, that person's going to recover very quickly and be back at work, we would not consider that to be a SIFp potential situation. And yet they were spending a lot of their time, their fairly precious, scarce time, investigating incidents that they probably didn't need to.
Yep. So this was a really good opportunity for this organisation to start thinking about how they were categorising their incidents and how they were thinking not just about what actually happened, but also about what could potentially be happening. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And for any safety professionals on this webinar who are in the audience in this webinar, you may be nodding your head vigorously or shaking your head saying, I don't get that. But if you're nodding your head vigorously, it means you're probably one of those people that is sometimes forced to investigate an incident that you really question whether or not you should be. And you probably know of incidents that probably should have received a big red flag and didn't for whatever reason. We've all got examples of those in our operational background.
Yeah, fantastic. I think it's also a really good opportunity at this point to briefly give a few generic kind of examples that came out of this data of the sorts of incidents that were rated by you in that SIFp category. Sure.
Yeah, so when we're talking about potential, Amy, because this is what this is all about. It's actually not looking at the outcome per se. It's actually looking at what could have happened if just one thing changed. And we try to, if we allowed 2 things or 3 things to change, of course, we could probably throw every incident into the serious bucket. But we do try to be really defined around setting that parameter quite tightly. So we have to know what that one thing that would have changed. And it could be simply somebody, who's about to walk out into the face of oncoming traffic, and just at the last second, they're distracted and actually turn and notice that there's a vehicle coming their way, who also may not have actually noticed them. This is just a very, very simple example. And there's an avoidance of the worst possible outcome, but it was really only very fortunate that it happened that way. And very easy to pinpoint what that one thing that might have changed, could have been. We would consider those situations when they are reported to be very serious, because what you want to know is what happened around that physical geographical situation where we didn't have adequate controls, where it's quite obvious that somebody could easily step into the wrong space. That incident is one that would probably in most organisations' databases land, it might not even get reported at all. If it does get reported to be a near miss, if it was reported as a near miss, it would usually not receive any further attention. We would say, no, it actually deserves a lot more attention than that. Conversely, somebody who steps down off the cab of their truck, puts their foot on a rock that they didn't see, and it twists their ankle. And in fact, they're really, like their ankle's pretty bad and they're not going to be able to work for a couple of days. In fact, they're not even sure if they can actually drive their truck back to the depot. We would say that that's a nasty situation for that, for that driver, but it's not a SIFp potential situation, regardless of how many days that person's off, because that twisted or even broken ankle, for that matter, yes, it's unpleasant, but for some people more than unpleasant, but not serious enough. Whereas something, like if I'm standing near a forklift truck, and in fact that forklift truck actually backs over my foot, and I break my foot in that situation, I've got to say I've got the same outcome, but I'm very, very much more concerned about the potential for something far worse. So I'd want that one pushed right up the red flag.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. And I think that really does help understand the sorts of considerations you're making with these incidents and the categorization of the incidents. I can recall there was a few instances for this organization around motor vehicles where they might have had the truck roll for a bit without the handbrake on. No one was hurt, but again, you can see the potential for somebody being hurt there. And another incident where there was an alarm that was sounding, but the people in that area couldn't actually hear the alarm, and it was only that someone happened to be nearby who were able to come across and notify them. So little things like that where nobody was hurt. I probably shouldn't say little, should I? Events where nobody was hurt would have the potential for things to go badly. So
it requires a bit of education. That's why when you're trying to lift the bar in terms of reporting, in order that you really do genuinely, if you genuinely want to learn about how your operation is actually managing risk in the field. And particularly when the field is not actually within your line of sight, it's not inside four walls. You're really relying upon people's motivation and their interest and their understanding of how important it is to learn about, when each of these things occurs. And of course, the only way that happens, of course, is a no blame culture. So, cultures that have a very high blame content, with frontline workers, that's their first challenge. That's the first hurdle to get over, of course, to get that reporting happening. But once you've got it happening, and the frontline guys who are the most at risk, they understand what the benefit is in that reporting. You've got to do something about it. You've actually then got to start looking at what are the fundamental themes behind each of these failures each time.
Yes.
And the great thing was this organisation really took that very seriously.
Yeah, which is a really nice link in thinking about some of those fundamental themes that sat behind some of these failures. This slide here, Warren, gives us a few examples of these sorts of loss of control, collision, rollaway issues that might have happened, and the sorts of controls that could have been in place that weren't in place.
What a variety, isn't it? You notice that this is an organisation that you think, well, there's going to be 3 or 4 risk categories. We're going to see, sort of most of the serious incident potential residing, but in this case, it was right across a very wide spectrum of risk areas. And some of these risk areas, for a lot of organisations, they don't get a lot of attention in terms of meaningful control mechanisms designed to protect the worker that aren't completely reliant upon that worker being highly reliable or perfect in their operation, or basically behaving like a robot. I mean, this is what we assume with a lot of our controls that we put in place, particularly relating to remote work or working in vehicles, is that that driver or that operator will actually always be able to make the right call, always be completely attentive, to their surroundings, be making the right decision at the right moment. And that's not reasonable to expect. Like, we're all hardwired to make mistakes. So it's interesting, some of these areas like extreme temperature exposure, uncontrollable lease of energy, hazardous substance exposure, there were more than just a handful of incidents in each of those areas that were actually quite surprising to this organisation. They expected a lot of motor vehicle related incidents, collision, loss of control, roll away, as you just described, Amy. But animal attack and working alone we tend to aggregate that together because the controls are actually usually fairly similar. You know, they're about actually preparing yourself for the potential for, you know, an uncontrolled environment, you know, to be either attacked by something as simple as a wasp, you know, or as something potentially nasty as a brown snake that you haven't seen, but you've just stepped over. And that's actually happened to me, you know, in a work context where I feel I was really very lucky at the time because I was actually working alone and I probably didn't have the training or the knowledge about what to do next in that situation. Working at height's a classic. Inadequate fall protection. You would think in this day and age, you're never going to see somebody operating above 4 or 5 feet, you know, well, sorry, imperial language, above 1.5 meters without some form of protection, an adequate form of protection. But in fact, it happens all the time. Especially when it's not the core work of that, you know, of that organisation to be operating at height. So there were lots of really interesting outputs that came out of this data for this particular organisation that they weren't really completely ready for, but really appreciated.
Yeah, and you've reminded me that working at height was also related to working at ground level, but above a potential fall down into a pit or down into the ground as well. So there was kind of that additional level of considerations. You know, you're standing on the ground, but you still have a significant fall risk attached to this particular task.
And interesting, Amy, we actually, there's one other category of work at height which might surprise people. Working on flat ground or being on flat ground and falling backwards, you know, is considered to be a SIFp potential situation. You might think, why on earth would that be a SIFp potential situation? It's because you don't know what's behind you. And if your head's going to hit a sharp object on flat ground, that's going to be as bad, if not worse, than falling 1.5 meters, you know, onto your feet. Interesting fact.
Yeah, really good fact. Yeah, thanks, Warren. You can all briefly pause for a moment and imagine that situation. So you started to talk there, Warren, around controls and the sorts of things an organisation would have in place for managing some of these. And so I know that one of the things you spend time looking at is that sense of enablement of those controls. So are the factors that should be in place for the organisation, for the people who are doing the work to try and prevent any harm from occurring. So as we've mentioned, we've divided the analysis between non-vehicle incidents and vehicle-specific incidents. You started to mention before the differences in the sorts of controls that are in place, so it made sense to make that change. Can you talk us through some of this data?
And I'll be brief because I know we're sort of 3/4 of the way, or getting, you know, 2/3 of the way through our session. For those on this webinar, in the webinar audience, who have an organisation that does control verification in the field, and you gather data about how well controls are being, you know, implemented as part of conversations with frontline workers, this will all ring true to you because, you know, and don't forget, we're measuring incidents here. We're not measuring all work. We're, you know, what we're doing is we're analysing when something has gone wrong. However, it's a very good indicator for even when things go right, because the vast majority of time, even when relevant controls that we would expect to be employed that aren't, and people have taken shortcuts or whatever, you know, to get the job done, usually just to get the job done, you know, within whatever the schedule is. Even that work that goes successfully won't always be done by the book. And anybody who's been out in the field who gets to talk to frontline operators and, you know, frontline workers, you know it to be true. You know, there's lots of evidence of that. Doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean they're making mistakes. Often it means they've had to find a way to work around an imperfect situation. Yet there might be a certain tool or a certain procedure that ought to be used in this particular context. And in fact, somehow it's just not going to work that easily, you know, given that particular operating context, which is you can't legislate for every single situation. You know, when you write when you write up your risk register, you do your bow tie analysis, you develop your control architecture, you work out what those controls need to look like and the performance standards that sit behind them. And suddenly you find in the field that 50, 60, 70% of them are actually being employed as you expected, 30 or 40 not. And what we found is that at least, Well, around the 40% mark of controls for non-vehicle related incidents were somehow difficult to employ. You know, and I'll give you an example. One small example is, let's say we set a 2-metre exclusion zone around forklifts, but we put those guys in close proximity to each other, 4 forklifts operating on a dock, and they only have enough space to be able to operate at the schedule that they're required to and keep barely a 1-metre exclusion zone. We know what that means for pedestrians and for people who are also walking around that dock. It just means that it's dodging cars. Now, are they breaking the rule, or did they not get set up for success in the first place? We know that a lot of workers don't get perfectly set up for success, and it's not because leaders don't care. It's because sometimes we're constrained. Sometimes procurement back in the centre of the organisation decided that the best gloves were the cheapest ones, for our operators to use. And our operators just get sweaty fingers, can't feel, they can't use fine motor movements, with their hands with these really cheap rubbishy gloves. And lo and behold, they take them off, because that's the only way they can get the job done. So there's lots and lots of examples like that. In the motor vehicle area, it's a different story. Apart from doing routine inspections or pre-journey inspections of vehicles and making sure they're properly maintained, basically it's just down to the driver. Like, it's down to the driver making the right decision, behaving the right way, trying to make it a smooth trip, decelerating with plenty of advance warning, no big steering movements, no dramatic steering movements, always being under steady control of the vehicle, and on the lookout and with peripheral vision, what's going on all the time around them. You can't do that for an 8-hour shift. If you're out on the road for 8 hours, it is impossible to be on your game all of that time. So we can say, well, look, your controls are enabled because you're the control, in a motor vehicle context. It's not as simple as that. If we're seeing repeated incidents over and over again where people are forgetting to do something that's about their load and making sure their load is locked down, then maybe it's time to think about a technological solution that actually disallows the vehicle from moving. Much like forklifts, for instance, you can't switch them on if you haven't got the seatbelt connected. And if you're sitting on the seatbelt, which a lot of guys do, nowadays the technology realizes that that's actually the case because there's no tension on the seatbelt. So sometimes it's actually better to actually think about, well, how do we strengthen the control rather than how do we keep on flogging the employee to be more attentive and do the right thing more often. And that's that control enablement analysis is actually really important to throw that right up into sharp focus, for organisations who think they've got everything set up for success. It hardly ever is. Yeah. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too long, Amy.
All good, Warren. And I think it really paints a nice picture of how complex each of these controls really are, with the different elements coming into play. And they require quite a bit of thought, particularly to make good, lasting change as well. It's a really good examples. Thanks. Our next slide covers off some of the learnings. And again, there was such a variety of information. It was hard to summarize this down to just a few key points for this case study. But this set of causal factors really gave us a good sense of the range of issues that were occurring for the organization, and unpacking the various incidents and looking at the controls that you've been mentioning have given us a sense of that sort of human error factors you were starting to describe there, that sense of autopilot that might occur if you're eight hours into a shift, the various different incidents that might have related to that sort of non-responsiveness in terms of past exposures. So this was evident in some of the data, Warren, where incidents had occurred before and they were repeatedly occurring, but things weren't changing. And so it was that opportunity to learn from those repeat incidents from this data set as well. Is there anything else you wanted to call out on this slide?
Look, I'll just add to that, because I think this is one of the most fascinating outcomes, and sometimes difficult for leadership to own up to, is that, we see the same incident. Just the colour and movement's a little bit different each time, but basically the same incident has occurred almost on a regular monthly basis over a 2-year time frame. So we got 20 or 30 of these incidents that really, for all intent and purpose, they're going to have the same kind of incident investigation outcome. I'm always asking myself, at what point did somebody say, we don't need to bother doing anything differently about this? You know, or conversely, at what point does somebody say, wow, enough's enough. We have to fundamentally rethink how we control this particular task. And this pops up a hell of a lot. Now, I don't put all of that onus on, you know, supervisors and, you know, operational managers, because sometimes they're constrained by budgets. Sometimes they're constrained by a central safety management function that determines how those things are done. You know, they don't do risk assessments themselves. They do that centrally. They have that done centrally. You know, so sometimes what this does is actually starts to reveal, this kind of analysis reveals where in the system have we got some sort of blockage around improving exposure management. And that was a fascinating exercise for us. Interesting, poor risk assessments. Nearly, well, more than a quarter, nearly a third of incidents had a risk assessment failure or inadequate risk assessment right up front as one of the chief causal factors. And that's risk assessment as a competence in general, but also the carrying out of the risk assessment, you know, being done in a bit of a half-assed sort of way. So there's two elements to that. And plant and equipment, the last one was important too.
Yes. I'm just curious, is that consistent with things you see in other organisations?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's because we will tend to shortchange those things that we think we've done before. We don't need to do it again because there's not much more to learn. But of course, every physical context and every task context is going to be uniquely different. That's why we say to supervisors and frontline workers, when you're at a pre-start, really think hard about, you know, we're almost rehearsing or scenario planning what could go wrong today, because you might think you've addressed everything that's ever going to happen. Guaranteed there'll be something that pops up today that you hadn't anticipated. And the question is not just scenario planning, then it's, if something changes unexpectedly, what are we going to do about it? Well, the first thing we do is stop. That's the biggest one. We're going to stop working and we're going to have reconsider. And that's where most work teams don't, because most work teams feel the need to get the job done.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Warren. This next slide here, sorry, it's jumped a few. There we go. You mentioned briefly at the start, you know, we had the opportunity with the data set that was here to delve into the hazard reporting of this organization as well, which was really fascinating. And as you mentioned, there was that opportunity to look at those weak signals. And now that we've sort of covered off on some of those sorts of incidents that were being picked up with that SIFp potential, some of those hazards and weak signals overlapped really well, didn't they?
Yeah, and I think what it did, it motivated this organisation to go back and actually do something more constructive with this data, rather than just simply, you know, shoving stuff into the hazard register and, you know, making sure that the action cycle kind of met its, you know, expected, you know, 30, 60, 90-day fixed time. It's actually looking at the data. What's the data telling us about fundamental weaknesses in our, you know, in our controls architecture, not just in housekeeping, but, you know, because hazards aren't just about housekeeping. You know, hazards are about, you know, weak and frayed, you know, strapping, you know, on, you know, with load management. You know, it's about fall from height equipment that's never been recertified, you know, for the last 4 years, you know, and so forth and so on. It's actually, do we take the wheel off the vehicle to check the wheel nuts and check the facing between, you know, the disc, you know, and the wheel itself, and not wait for the wheel to fall off because we're in a very dusty environment. And that's what's happened so many times with the last couple of projects that we've worked on, you know, really surprising things that have occurred, but it's taken sort of 4, 5, 6, 7 examples of something that we should have been paying attention to before suddenly there's a really nasty incident. Now, if we were paying attention earlier in the process, we would have got ahead of that, you know, in almost every case. Because if people do report hazards, if they do notice particularly things like isolation breaches, people, you know, people working with electricity or things under pressure and not doing it in the right way, if you notice that stuff and you report it, it's like gold. Like it's the information is so powerful in terms of us getting ahead of the next incident occurring. It's not funny.
Yes, and you really need people to have that SIFp or high potential lens on their hazards as well to do that well. Yes,
and that's got to be people who lead the operation. themselves. They had to be vitally interested in it. It's not the safety dude. Like the safety advisor can't take responsibility for waving all these red flags all the time. You know, people will stop listening to them.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why we spend so much time talking about culture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. There were a range of different recommendations, many of which were quite specific to the sorts of incidents that were occurring for this organisation, but we've summarised them at that higher level into these three broad categories, just to give that sense to the listeners today around the sorts of system improvements, the different field exposure, risk management, and that leadership side of things. We've only got a couple of minutes, but I would love if you could give a very quick talk through some of these.
We're interested, fundamentally, there's medium term and there's immediate containment. So we tend to break those, like our strategies up in those two. In terms of the strategies that come from this kind of analysis, what is the immediate containment opportunity for exposures that are not being managed as they need to be managed right now? Because if tomorrow something bad happens, and we're doing a debrief with an executive team around the findings of this, and they haven't got something they can immediately take away that stops those events from happening, then we haven't done our job, basically. But inevitably, we would all know, you know, you and me, Amy, and all of the people on this call, that it's never just as simple as the quick fix in the field. There's almost always going to be system elements, you know, that sit behind that. Like, how are even people being rewarded and recognised, for instance, for safety improvement? You know, if it's about lost time injury reduction, as an example, we know where that lands us. It doesn't land us in a good space. If it's about a risk management framework that hasn't actually even captured all of the critical risks in the organisation because it's never been updated for the last 5 years. So we don't even have certain things called out as risks, and therefore we don't treat them seriously as risks, then there's a great place to start, as an example. So if we just flick to the next slide, Amy, a few of the actual... So we worked on the critical controls in this case. We did a validation of whether or not the controls are the best controls for their risk profile. We looked at the erosion factors that tend to erode the importance, or the health of those controls and how effective they are. We looked at the way leadership engages with the operations, in terms of influencing and reinforcing the need to be compliant where possible and where appropriate. But if you can't be, then think very carefully about the hazard and how you're going to address it, because we know that the controls architecture isn't going to be suitable 100% of the time. Categorisation of incidents was a big one for these guys. In fact, there's a quarterly assurance process happening now where they get me to check in on whether or not they're actually categorising incidents the right way each quarter, for the last quarter. Fascinatingly, having done that now, tremendous improvement in their overall incident rate. And it's a valid improvement. And there's also tremendous improvement in their SIFp potential frequency as well. Once again, that's about as valid as I could expect, because I'm actually auditing it each quarter. And that's what an ongoing assurance and monitoring is all about.
It's been a really good opportunity for people internal to this organisation to really learn and think about it in that different lens with the incidents that were coming in, isn't it? So that assurance and monitoring process has really supported that internal education.
Effectively, it's like a coaching event quarterly. There's some analysis happening, but we're actually just continuing to coach and try and embed the same capability internally. The additional analysis of non-SIFp incidents, including control breaches. So there was another separate project to look at slips, trips, falls, blood, break, bruise kind of incidents. The ones that aren't, nobody's going to die. There's a lot more of them. They cost a lot. They cost huge amounts of money for this organisation, as they probably do for most. Because a lot of organisations self-insure themselves, and they pay their compensation claims out. Basically out of the bottom line. And in this instance, there was a really fascinating set of outputs from that. Very, very specific targeted interventions for people, at that particular level. It's been a tremendous experience to be involved in this journey, with these guys.
Yeah, you're right. The non-SIFp incident analysis had a totally different set of incident types and controls,
Yeah.
and it was a useful, I mean, it would be an additional case study webinar for us to run.
What, another time, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Sorry,
really
so we
great.
just had we've got some questions lining up, so
lovely.
think,
well, that's kind of perfect timing. Fantastic. Thank you to those who've already started to add some questions in. We'd love to invite you, if you've got some questions, to start popping them into the Q&A box or the chat box. We'll monitor both of them. In the meantime, while we wait for some of those to be typed in, if you'd like to get some more information from us on the meta incident analysis process, you've just got to tick the little yes that Cassie's put up on the screen there, and it will come through to our system, and we can email that through to you after the session today.
So while you're doing that, can I
Yes.
respond to Raphael's got a couple up here.
Awesome.
So thank you, Raphael. That's fantastic. 2 questions. Question 55% due to unintended operator error, but how many of these were due to either the lack of training and or lack of supervision of non-trained or competent staff? I noticed training is not mentioned. So training is one of the organisation's systems that are designed, obviously, to make having a competent workforce is a bit of a no-brainer. You know, if you're placing unskilled or lacking in experienced workers in difficult high-risk situations, you're looking for a problem, a serious problem. We're talking about here, we're making the presumption that unless skill, when we're looking at the incident investigation, unless skill or competence requirements haven't been met by a particular operator and it's called out in the investigation, we will assume they are a competent worker, that they know what they're doing, and that they have been then prey to the classical kind of forgot, was switched off, didn't notice, the hazard. There's a good half dozen what we call cognitive hazards that tend to contribute to, that human error component. They're called unintended errors. Where it's an intentional error, it's a different story. Intentional errors have a different sort of look and feel to them because they're usually about people having some reason to work around the rule. Sometimes when we see incidents where skill and knowledge is an issue, we will definitely call out training. And in fact, you, Raphael and the rest of the audience have only seen a very small fraction of the data. Training and competence comes up quite frequently, as one of the drivers of these incidents. We're just talking about these, that initial human error rationale for why has somebody just not quite done what they were supposed to do in that particular moment. The other question, was there a tool or process used to determine the quality of actual incident reporting? Yes. So we look at. Good question. Yeah, very good question. And some people even ask, how on earth can you analyse an incident when all you've got is a paragraph of narrative around it and nothing else? And that is often the case. We go back to organisations to fill up the gaps. Where we cannot make a call. We're suspicious this incident could be serious. We don't know enough about it to actually really extract, the key themes. So we will go back to get information that fills up those gaps. That's just to preempt that particular question. But we also assess the degree to which investigations have covered off on the basic requirements, which are, there's a narrative that tells us clearly what happened, clearly enough to understand and visualize what's occurred. There's causal analysis that actually gets to the bottom of, most of the reasons why this event has occurred, both at a human level and an organization system level. And then there's actions that actually make sense, that actually will effectively reduce exposure rather than just be another Band-Aid. Like, let's have a chat at the pre-starts next week about this issue. That is not an exposure reduction action. Fundamentally changing the strength of a control, moving it from behavioural to a technological control, that is an action, for instance, that'll actually make a difference. So we do provide data back to organisations about that. But I'll be frank with you, it's usually their investigation quality is so variable and usually so poor. And this is universal across even the most mature organisations that, there's actually usually one simple recommendation: do it better. And there are ways to actually improve it, quite significantly.
Yeah,
So thank you for that.
Yeah, and you know, you can see even from this case study that directing your attention to the right sets of incidents is going to mean that you'll have potentially a bit more time to be able to give them the attention they really deserve, which is also a way of doing it better, isn't it? I think your conversation there, Warren, leads really nicely into thinking more broadly about critical controls and critical control assurance. So there's a variety of different services that Incident Analytics and Sentis offer in terms of that assessment and consulting to support that approach. So if you'd like to receive our critical control assurance brochure, Cassie's got that poll up on the screen there. And then I think we potentially have one more question.
Yeah, I've had some pre-questions also come through as well. First is the reliability of this approach with smaller data sets, and how small is too small in terms of numbers of incidences to look at?
Good question. Yeah, look, small operations, in fact, that are often quite well run, don't have very many incidents, but they're actually just as concerned about them as the organisation that has lots. In fact, sometimes more so, and that's how they got there, because they're highly attuned to wanting to learn from every single thing that goes wrong. We've worked with organisations with as small a sample group of 60 incidents in a year, and only about 10 of those were serious. And for them, that was information they badly wanted and needed, because they weren't shifting their incident rate. They were suspicious, for instance, that they had just as many serious events occurring as a proportion of that 60 odd. And so that small scale activity, was really worthwhile for that organisation. If a single depot, for instance, as part of a larger organisation, it's probably not the thing that we would, we wouldn't drill down to that level. We certainly can in the reporting if there's enough data, but for a single project, to help just like a small outpost of an organisation, it probably isn't good use of their resources. But as small as 50 or 60 incidents a year, right up to, I've worked with an organisation that had 12,500 incidents per year. Which was a bit scary. Just the sheer volume of things going wrong, were being extraordinary.
Yeah, that's huge. And what we're looking at here is those themes, those consistent underlying causes. So I think that's important to think about there. So the reliability really comes from the consistent way that you assess each incident report with the same lens and the same set of questions and the same categorizations of each incident that you look at. And that's where we can get that sense of reliability in the data that you're coming out with. Yeah, that's great.
Any other pre-questions?
Yeah, we've probably just got time for one more. So this one would be directed at you, Warren. The company that you partnered with, did they use paper-based reporting? If so, are they continuing paper-based, or have you moved to a digital platform? If you've moved to a digital platform, was this a major factor in the improvements?
So we're talking about the company that this case study is about? Yeah, that
this case study is about, yeah.
All digital, that's very little paper-based. The quicker you can move from paper-based, the better. And it is relatively inexpensive and fairly easy to deploy these days. Basic systems that allow field information to be captured and to go into a central system and be available immediately, for further analysis. Absolutely. But yeah, sure. Look, if you've got really good quality and high volumes of paper-based information, get it digitized as quickly as possible. Don't lose it, whatever you do.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you so much for joining us today, Warren. Really appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation, and really appreciate everyone's chat comments and questions that have come in advance as well. If
Thanks,
anyone
Amy.
would like to reach out to us, please connect with us on LinkedIn, or send through any comments or things over email as well.
Thank you, everyone. And on behalf of Sentis, I'd like to thank Amy and Warren for presenting to us today, and thank everyone for joining us. Our next online masterclass, Psychosocial Safety, is coming up on Thursday, the 31st of August. And I did put a 20% discount code in the comments if anyone is interested in attending that. Until then, stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.